Somalië.
50,000 people died in Hargeisa city alone. 250,000 were killed during the civil war. And 1 million of our people sought refuge in neighboring countries, Ethiopia, Yemen, Djibouti. That was the army fighting the civilians who had paid taxes to support the army. So the civilians were actually paying for the guns and the ammunition that was used against them. If that's not genocide, I don't know what is.
Voor de burgeroorlog woonden in Hargeisa 500.000 mensen. Bij de gevechten in mei 88 vielen er meer dan 60.000 doden. De rest van de bevolking sloeg op de vlucht.
There was much dead body, so we burying that dead body at the night time, because in the daylight we are afraid of the bombing and killing. In the night times, all the night times we are burying on the dead body and getting some water and some fruits all the night times. All the day times we are just laying on for bombing of air attack and heavy artillery.
meel bakhaaraho bayaan mushtara ayaan ugu fadhiyay halkiiba maalinimadina laga dareeray ee hubkii awaan.
This woman was a shop owner. She was a businesswoman. I think. Just go.
Lagu qaraacay gurigii ayaa markaa lagu xareeyay 3 cisho ayaan markaa gurigii ku jiray iyo raashinkii aanu dhimanay ay naga boodeen oo gurigii ka baadheen.
They looted the food rations that the civilians had in their homes. They were surrounded and kept indoors for 3 days without food, without water.
صدق حريم بلدان كتيرني أيام ويسني هذا ما كان معلومة قومي مخاهدي كذا أو إحراشنا كسوقات ما كان يقولي كسوق حماية كان مصاب المال دوحة أيام صاحة لأن يدي يسوق صنعنا كل كان ما في دوحة كسوق لنا أيام ميرد بلدان عربيين وصارت نسي شو بعد يسقطوا وفرنا هي أواصل من الوراء هاي ما كان يسقط ويرجع صنع نسوق كسوق في
When the bombings continue, we decide to go through Ethiopia, this nearest border we can reach. In this case, we are started to walk on foot, and it takes for us about 12 days. On the road, you always see the people, the elders, the children, women, all just running each other on the road. And that's to the border.
That's a refugee camp that housed 1 million refugees. There was Du'ad, there was Qaho, and there was, where was the other one? Dahor, Abokar. There were 4 or 5 refugee camps, each with over 100,000 refugees.
De Ogaden-woestijn in het oosten van Ethiopië. Een van de meest onherbergzame gebieden van het land. In juli 88 kwamen hier in een paar dagen tijd bijna 500.000 vluchtelingen aan. De oorlog in Somalië bleef in het wereldnieuws maanden onopgemerkt. En dat duurde dan ook lang voordat de hulpverlening hier op gang kwam. Het Hoge Commissariaat voor de Vluchtelingen stond voor de bijna hopeloze taak om in deze woestijn de vluchtelingen in leven te houden. Hargeisa was voor de oorlog een welvarende stad. De vluchtelingen die hier vandaan kwamen zijn dan ook goed opgeleide vaklui, handelaren en intellectuelen. Zonder enige noemenswaardige bezittingen moesten ze van de ene op de andere dag wennen aan een vluchtelingenbestaan.
This is my family. This is my children, the wife, the sister of the wife, and my children. Some of them are not here. And this is the fence I like with my boys. And this is the kitchen we cook. That's the kitchens of the family. And also this is the tent of the men and wives also sleeping. And that's the present situation we got here. That's it.
De Somalische vluchtelingen zijn eigenlijk nooit nieuws geweest. Ruim 3 jaar zitten ze nu al in dit kamp. Nog dagelijks komen er nieuwe bij. Vooral uit het zuiden van Somalië, waar troepen van de gevallen president Bar oorlog voeren met de nieuwe machthebbers. Iedereen moet zich in het kamp laten registreren. Alleen dan heb je recht op gerantsoeneerd voedsel.
When the refugee comes, especially in the Hashins, it's very strange for us. Anybody is like this. It's very strange. But thousands of people who was satisfied and blind, waiting something to do. And there's no water, there's no home, there's no anything. There's no tent, there's no home. There's no water, and I am very strange and wonder it happens. It is like this on my age. I don't expect it on this day. And it's still very difficult for us, and we wonder. And it is, I told myself it's better to believe that will is better. That is what I told my life on this situation.
Ibrahim was in Hargeisa een succesvol man. Als manager van de luchthaven had hij een goed salaris, bedienden en een groot eigen huis. De verwoesting van de stad verraste ook hem en zijn gezin volledig.
aad bay dowrka u dhiman qof shaqaysan jiray oo raaxaysan jiray markuu aan baryo uu tuga dowr aad bay dowrka dhiman markaa noloshii dee horen ku noolaan jirnay da nolosheen kasku mid maha waxayn dhow dhexeey qof shaqaystay oo nolol wanaagsan kusoo noolaa markuu dee la kulmo baryo nusqaan iyo dhigan
We lived a life where we earned a living when we had comfort. And it's strange for us to be somewhere where we have no food, no water, and we just don't know what to do.
waxaan dareemayaa dadku markii hore aan gacanta ku hayay dad wax aan baray oo tacliin bartay oo dhaxayay oo nidaam leh oo fiican bay ahaayeen intii aan dibadda usoo baxnay dadkii waxay noqdeen wax qaarkood bay ku dhaqaaqeen markii hore noloshina aad u daciiftay.
My children have been attending school. Since we became refugees, the character of my children have changed. They have become rebellious, and they have resorted to petty crime.
sharaftii aad u daciiftay quruxdoodii aad u daciiftay waxbarashadoodii aanay jirin wax ciidanka kolkii dambe ku fiireen wadee dhibaatooyin badan ayaa korintoodii dambe 3 sannadood iga qabsatay hoy la-aan waxyaabo badan ayaa 3 sannadood dhibaato fog leega soo qabsatay hayntoodii
Mass graves.
Sinds 2 jaar heeft Ibrahim weer een baan. In het kamp is hij op vrijwillige basis een soort gezondheidswerker. Hij is verantwoordelijk voor de juiste uitvoering van een talrijke begrafenis. En verder moet hij bij zijn dagelijkse rondje in het kamp nieuwe ziektegevallen opsporen en registreren.
The feeling of my wife, whenever we saw somebody who needed assistance, and we could not do anything for that, he becomes angry, hopeless. These dead bodies, most of them, some of them dying for dehydration, and some of them is dying for, especially for children, they are dying for diarrhea, measles, and so on. So there's no vaccine for them most of the times. Sometimes you got some, but most of the time there's no vaccine. So you can see that most of the people is dying without assistance or without supply for themselves.
iyada hadda marka ku ilaalay inta maaragtay isbedelka uu haddana dee dhacayo mooyaane wax kale xataa ku qabanaa ma jirto waxay ku xidhan kale miina maalintii kushinaya miina ku xidhan hada waxay soo goyeen oo dhanka miina ku xidhan inta dhamana miinada inay ilaa marka xasoo way goysanayeen waa arkeen markay goynayo كوالد هاي سكان يو قراءة مقارنة في كتير وقالها أيوة
When they returned to the houses, they found the dwellings littered with landmines, because many of the houses had been looted. The army took corrugated iron roofs, the windows, the doors, and then left landmines behind to blow up on the civilians if and when they would return to the cities. But my father's house had 7 landmines in it when we returned to it. I can speak for one house, 7 landmines.
نرتب السوق معينتي كسر مقنعه كلام مسح معناتها كسر مقنعه عادي لو بسنانه أقل كان كهدرة مالية تشخص هذا كهدرة يدوش حفظ يتغفل على كثيرين حوالي ما في ضيعات فيحطق كل الفكرة تكون هتكسر كان الله يتكرسيلة دي ما الفرق متحقون في كتن السلام بالقدر هاي جبتهم عندنا قطرة ولا عندي
This is my house. This is the bedroom, second room here. This is the bedroom and toilet. Bedroom and toilet here. Right.
When the civilians returned to
That room on this side.
after liberation. And what they found was 95% of the city was leveled to the ground. The streets were littered with dead corpses and human remains. And one of the things that was most noticeable was the number of dogs, because dogs had been living on the human carcasses, and they had never seen that many dogs living in the streets before in the city. That's the human carnage that took place. And the airplanes that caused the bombings took off from the airport of Hargeisa. It's as if planes took off from the airport in Brussels only to bomb the city of Brussels. They were referred to as 4-minute sorties. It would take 4 minutes for the plane to take off, empty its holds on the city, and land again. That's how close the target was. And for every sortie, the captains of those MiG fighters were paid $4,000. So the more sorties you made, the more $4,000 you earned, and the more civilians you killed. Civilians who paid for your salary, who paid for the bombs, who paid for the army.
Such things happen from the humans. Very, very sorrowful. Mankind cannot be thinking such destruction like this. The fighting can be happening, but such destruction of the city, never thinks. Nobody can think such things happen. The present situation is difficult to bear and think, because we are in survival living only. Never thinking how to bear this now, but how to survive itself.
Ibrahim is geen uitzondering. Hij en de andere teruggekeerde vluchtelingen staan voor de bijna onmogelijke taak hun huizen en stad weer op te bouwen. Ze voelen zich vergeten. De wereld is nauwelijks geïnteresseerd in dit deel van de wereld. Honderdduizenden verkiezen daarom nog steeds een verblijf in een vluchtelingenkamp, midden in de woestijn van Ethiopië. Daar is tenminste nog voedsel en water. Bovendien heeft het leger van het vorige regime in deze stad nog zo'n 500.000 mijnen neergelegd. Maar toch zijn er 100.000 mensen teruggekeerd. Met een paar golfplaten op een uit het vluchtelingenkamp meegebrachte tent woont men op de plek waar ooit een woning stond. 2 dagen na hun aankomst had ook het gezin van Ibrahim in een van de vroegere kamers een onderkomen gevonden.
Why Europe, America, Canada, and every country in the world received large influxes of refugees. There were waves and waves of refugees from Somaliland that came to your shores, and you gave them shelter. You protected them from their own soldiers. You gave them food. You gave education to their children. Scandinavian countries, Britain, Canada, US, Arab countries, Arab Gulf countries, they ran from their own soldiers to you for shelter. And today the wave of Somalis who come to you come from Somalia, because most Somalilanders have returned home. We are all returnees, the ministers and myself. We're all refugees who have returned from the world, from anywhere, from elsewhere, to go back to Somaliland to rebuild Somaliland. The waves of Somalis that you receive today are from Italian Somalia, la Somalia Italiana. And if peace should not return to the Horn of Africa, and heaven forbid, should there be a war again between Somaliland and Somalia, you would receive more waves and waves of refugees coming from the Horn of Africa. And that's what we want to prevent. We want our people to return, who have returned to that country, Somaliland, to remain in that country, to take part in the reconstruction, to rebuild the country and show the world what Somalilands are made of. Somaliland today is a country where we have more children going to school. We have more schools, we have more hospitals, we have better roads, we have better businesses, we have better functioning airports than we ever had when we had a temporary union with La Somalia Italiana. Thank you very much.
The Federation of Somalia. Before that, incredibly, Somaliland was the 12th former British colony on the continent of Africa to receive our independence. Now Somaliland seeks our independence once more. I'm going to move. Are you speaking next? Yeah, okay. I'm going to move over to Michael Greaves, who's really going to put on his barrister's wig and speak very much about the legal case, the very legal case and the strong legal arguments for recognition for Somaliland. So, Michael, without further ado. Okay.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. There are very few bits of the earth left today that are not part of a country which has full international recognition, a seat at the United Nations and all that goes with the status of being a recognised state. Yet, right in the middle of one of the most strategically important regions on this planet sits this small country, Somaliland. And its importance is clear, given only a very quick glance at the map. It lies just to the north of its erstwhile partner in the failed union with Somalia. And we know quite a lot about that country. It's a country which Somalia has not functioned for the last 25 years as a state, but has been a state ruled by warlords and radical Islamists of Al-Shabaab, and the home to gangs of pirates that have played havoc with the passage of shipping along the Horn of Africa and down the east coast of the continent of Africa. On the other side of the water lies Yemen, and between the respective coasts of Yemen and Somaliland pass pretty much all the sea traffic using the vital Suez Canal route that runs between Southeast Asia and Australasia on the one hand, and Europe and the east coast of the United States on the other. And 10% of that traffic can't use the Suez Canal because it's too big, so it has to go down the east coast of Africa and round the Cape route. It doesn't take much of a genius to realise just how vital those waters are to the interests of the whole world. Not very far away is the Persian Gulf, and the importance of that seaway, again, needs no stressing by me. We all know exactly what it means to the west. It's a vital region. Yet since the dissolution of the union with Somalia, Somaliland has remained hitherto completely unrecognised by the entire world. So I want to just take a quick look at three things. Firstly, a little bit of history, then the issues, the legal issues that surround it, and then briefly look at the issue of recognition as it stands today. Somaliland came under British protection, and I'm going to start, and Somalilanders will forgive me for starting with the arrival of the British on the scene, because that's the best place to start. Established a protectorate in 1888. And it was garrisoned from Aden on the other side of the water, and was effectively administered as part of British India, remarkably, until 1898, and then in due course became under the aegis of the Colonial Office. 1940, the Italians invade British Somaliland, and it's the only campaign in which the Italians were victorious in World War II, overrunning the protectorate in August 1940, annexing it to their empire. It was recovered by British forces in March 1941 and then was returned to British rule. After the end of the Second World War, it became obvious that British Somaliland, like all other African colonies and protectorates, would become independent sooner rather than later. And so the next 15 years were spent in preparation for that moment. One aspect of that which is particularly germane to this issue, it comes from the archives of the British government. A lot of the work that was being done by the Colonial Office at that time, between 1945 and 1960, details discussions and agreements between the UK on the one hand and the neighbouring states, Ethiopia, which was independent, France and Italy, which were the colonial powers for Djibouti on the north and Somalia on the south. Many of those discussions were designed to fix the international borders of Somaliland. And you can see by going through the archive the process by which gradually agreements are made over individual bits of land, so that by the time the moment for independence comes up, there is full agreement as to what the future borders of Somaliland and indeed of Somalia were going to be. It is well understood that in due course, when independence came for Somaliland, that there was a desire to have a union with all Somaliland, also all Somali nations, and in particular that it would seek union with Italian Somaliland when it in turn became independent. The UK archives again are revealing. Some show that the UK was happy to encourage this union to take place, but there is something of a thread in the archives of warnings being given that some thought ought to be given as to whether this really was such a good idea after all. Notwithstanding that, events came to a climax. On the 26th of June, British Somaliland became independent as an international state. And no less than 35 other states in the world immediately signified their recognition of that fact, their recognition of the government of Somaliland as both the de facto and de jure government of a new state. And implicit in that recognition, and this is very important, they were accepting that Somaliland had the borders that had been agreed internationally. What then happens, and we can describe this in hindsight as something of a legal and political shambles, was the creation of the union with Somalia. I'm going to go into some detail, and I'm sorry if it's a little bit boring, but one would strive manfully to avoid detail, but it's quite crucial to the legal case that Somaliland has. It had been agreed in advance between representatives of both Somaliland and Somalia that there would be in due course an act of union, and that it would be signed by both states upon independence, and that that document would be in the nature of an international agreement between two states. The Legislative Assembly of Somaliland thus passed its own Union of Somaliland and Somalia law immediately upon independence on the 27th of June 1960. And in theory it was immediately effective in Somaliland. But it was anticipated that that document would also be signed by representatives of Somalia. In fact, that never happened, because the Legislative Assembly of Somalia met on the 30th of June, a day before its own independence, in order to consider what it was going to do. That body decided to approve in principle a completely different document in Italian, Atto di Unione, which was significantly different from the document that the Somalilanders had produced and passed in their legislative assembly. This new document requested the government of Somalia to establish with the government of Somaliland a definitive single text of the Act of Union to be submitted in due course to the National Assembly, that's of the new state, the new union, for approval. That is important because it suggests that both the Assembly in Somalia did not regard the Atto di Unione as being binding on Somaliland. It's difficult for us 50 years on to recall the enthusiasm and exuberance which predominated events surrounding independence in Africa in the early 60s. They were heady days as old colonies emerged from their chrysalis as bright new butterflies every few months. So what then happened may be seen perhaps as practical politics taking over and law and so on getting swallowed up in idealistic enthusiasm. On the 1st of July, the members of the Somaliland Legislative Assembly and its Somalia equivalent met in a joint session, and a constitution which had been drafted in Somalia was accepted on the basis of acclamation, and the provisional president was elected. That was in pursuit of the draft constitution which required such a thing to happen. Almost the first thing this new elected provisional president did was issue a decree to formalise the union. In the event, that decree was never converted into law as it was required to do. If a decree was not passed into law, it in theory ceased to have effect from ab initio, in other words, from the date of issue. So that any decree, a particular decree declaring a union, would have been void from the word go. So there's a very strong argument for saying the act of formalisation of the union was thus void. The other problem is that at this stage, as you will see, there's more than one version of a document floating around purporting to be an act of union. And any good lawyer will tell you that where there's a contract, if the terms of it must be broadly identical, at least in substance, if not in fact, or there's no contract. So there's a very, very strong case for asserting that the union of Somaliland and Somalia law had no legal validity in the South Somalia, and the approval in principle of the Atto di Unione was insufficient to make it legally binding in that territory. So what you have is two documents, neither of which are identical in terms.